I am Arthur. I am 32 years old. Exactly 3 days after I moved into the house I spent 6 relentless, grueling years saving for, my own parents slapped me with a lawsuit to take it away. While I was standing in my new living room, holding the legal papers that treated me like a common criminal, my father looked me dead in the eye over the phone and said, "That house belongs to your brother." They completely invalidated my hard work, humiliating me and treating my life's greatest achievement like a trust fund meant for someone else. But there is one thing they didn't know. My Uncle Henry was holding onto a notarized letter from my late grandparents, a weapon that would completely destroy their fabricated case. And now, they are the ones begging for my mercy as the bank threatens to take their own home. Before I tell you exactly how this nightmare unfolded, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to where it all started. I can still perfectly recall the smell of that Tuesday morning. It was a mixture of fresh interior paint, cardboard boxes, and pine cleaner. The morning sun was streaming through the large bay windows of my new living room, casting warm, golden rectangles across the original hardwood floors. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from 3 days of carrying heavy furniture up a flight of stairs by myself. But I had never felt happier in my entire life. This was a classic 2-story craftsman house tucked away on a quiet street at the edge of the city. It had a wraparound porch, mature oak trees in the front yard, and a solid brick foundation. The local real estate market had been an absolute nightmare. It was a relentless machine designed to chew up first-time buyers. I had navigated bidding wars, aggressive realtors, nerve-wracking home inspections, and the agonizing wait for the closing date. But I had won. The heavy brass keys sitting on the kitchen counter were the physical manifestation of my freedom. They represented every skipped vacation, every packed lunch I ate at my desk, and every late night I spent glaring at lines of code to earn overtime pay. I was on my knees in the kitchen, wrestling with a roll of packing tape and unpacking a box of cheap dishes I had bought from Walmart years ago, when the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the empty hallways. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, leaving a faint smudge of dust across my brow, and walked to the front door. I pulled the heavy oak door open, expecting a package delivery or maybe a neighbor coming to introduce themselves. Instead, a man in a wrinkled gray polo shirt and dark slacks was standing on my porch. He held a thick manila envelope and a clipboard. He had the flat, detached expression of a man who delivered bad news for a living. "Arthur Vance?" he asked. His voice was completely monotone. "That is me," I replied, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You have been served," he said. He pressed the thick envelope against my chest, turned on his heel, and walked quickly down my concrete driveway to an unmarked sedan parked on the street. I stood frozen on the porch. The neighborhood around me was painfully normal. A lawnmower hummed a few houses down. A woman in yoga pants was jogging past with her golden retriever. The sprinkler system next door clicked rhythmically. And there I was, holding a legal document that felt heavier than the house itself. I stepped back inside and locked the deadbolt. My fingers felt numb, almost clumsy, as I tore the top of the envelope off. I pulled out a thick stack of papers stapled together at the corner. The legal seal of the county courthouse was stamped on the front page. My eyes scanned the document, and the word plaintiff jumped off the crisp white page like a physical strike. Below it, 2 names were printed in bold black ink: Richard Vance and Eleanor Vance, my father and my mother. Right below their names was another Julian Vance, my younger brother. And right there, listed clearly next to defendant, was my name. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out through the air conditioning vents. I walked over to the kitchen island, the only piece of furniture I had managed to fully assemble, and spread the papers out on the granite countertop. It was a formal civil lawsuit. The legal jargon was dense, but the core message was terrifyingly clear. They were challenging the ownership of my property. They were formally claiming that the funds I used for the down payment were actually part of a disputed inheritance that was intended specifically for Julian. They were demanding an injunction and requesting that the deed be transferred immediately to his name. My vision blurred. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen was cracked slightly in the corner, a testament to how long I had refused to upgrade it, just to save an extra $100 a month. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the phone on the counter once before I managed to dial my father's number. It rang 3 times. Every ring amplified the pounding in my ears. "Arthur," Richard answered. His voice was completely devoid of warmth. It was the exact tone he used when negotiating a car price at a dealership or dismissing a waiter at a restaurant. Cold, calculating, and utterly superior. "Dad, what is this?" My voice shook. I hated that it shook, but I was terrified. "I just got handed a stack of legal papers by a process server. You are suing me? Over my own house." I could hear the television in the background on his end. A sports game, the roar of a crowd. He was sitting in his recliner, watching a football game, while dragging his eldest son into a legal bloodbath. "We need to discuss the situation with the property, Arthur," Richard said, his tone flat and official. "Your mother and I have spoken with an attorney. The funds designated for Julian's future home were meant to go to him. You knew that." I gripped the edge of the granite countertop until my knuckles turned completely white. "What funds? What in the world are you talking about? There were no designated funds. I bought this house with my own salary. I have the bank statements for the last 6 years. I can show every single deposit." "You are being difficult as always," Richard snapped, the irritation finally bleeding through his calm facade. "That house belongs to your brother. He needs it more than you do. He has been planning to settle down, and you pulled the rug right out from under him by taking his money. He never even looked at this house," I shouted, the sound echoing harshly off the empty walls of my kitchen. "He doesn't even have a job." The line clicked. Eleanor, my mother, had picked up the kitchen extension. "Arthur, please stop yelling at your father," she said softly. Her voice was dripping with that toxic, weaponized guilt she had perfected over decades. "We just want to make things right for Julian. You know how hard things have been for him. You make a good salary. You can just go buy another one. We are a family, sweetie. You have to share what you have." I felt physically sick to my stomach. Buy another one. As if 6 years of absolute financial deprivation, of eating cheap canned soup and driving a car with a failing transmission, was the equivalent of picking up an extra gallon of milk at the grocery store. They were entirely detached from reality. They were floating in a delusional bubble where Julian was the absolute center of the universe, and I was nothing but a disposable resource to be harvested whenever he needed something. "I am not giving up my home," I said. My voice dropped to a low, hard register I did not even recognize. The fear was suddenly replaced by a deep, dark rage. "Then we will see you in court, Arthur," Richard replied coldly. "We are filing the injunction tomorrow." The line went dead. I stood in the profound silence of my kitchen. The house I had bled for, the sanctuary I had built to escape them, was now a battleground. As I stared at the legal threat bearing my family's names, I realized a terrifying, undeniable truth. My parents were not confused. They were not mistaken. They were fully prepared to destroy my life, ruin my credit, and take everything I owned to pave the way for my brother. But they had drastically underestimated exactly how hard I was willing to fight back. To understand the sheer audacity of this lawsuit and the absolute insanity of their claims, you have to understand the toxic ecosystem I grew up in. Julian was not just the youngest child. He was the golden child. He was the sun around which my parents orbited, and I was just a satellite useful only for absorbing the impact of asteroids. I was 4 years older, which in their eyes simply meant I had a 4-year head start on learning how to be self-sufficient so they could focus entirely on him. The unfairness wasn't subtle. It was systemic. I remember my grandfather's funeral vividly. I was 16 years old. It was a somber, rainy afternoon in late October. My grandparents had lived modestly, but they had always proudly promised to help with their grandson's education. They frequently talked about a college fund they were putting together for us. A few months after the funeral, I sat at the dining room table, laying out my college brochures and calculating tuition costs. I was terrified of student debt. I asked my father about the college fund my grandfather had mentioned before he passed. Richard didn't even look up from his newspaper. He took a sip of his black coffee and casually destroyed my future. "We had to redirect those funds, Arthur," he said without a hint of remorse. "Julian needs a reliable vehicle for his extracurricular activities, and your mother wanted to renovate the kitchen. You are smart. You will figure out scholarships." I remember the profound sting of that moment. My grandfather's legacy, meant to secure my education, was currently parked in our driveway in the form of a brand new, fully loaded SUV for my 12-year-old brother, who did not even have a learner's permit yet. From that day forward, I knew I was entirely on my own. I worked 3 part-time jobs through my junior and senior years of high school and straight through college. I flipped burgers smelling like stale grease, I tutored wealthy kids in math, and I stocked shelves at a grocery store during the night shift. While Julian was taking European vacations financed by my parents' credit cards and attending expensive summer camps, I was eating ramen noodles in a damp basement apartment and tracking every single penny on a broken laptop. When I graduated and miraculously landed a solid job as a software engineer, the dynamic did not change. It only mutated into something uglier. My salary became a massive point of contention in the family. If I bought a new pair of work shoes, Eleanor would sigh heavily at family gatherings and say, "It must be nice to have disposable income, Arthur. Julian is struggling to pay his rent this month." Julian, for context, had dropped out of 3 different degree programs. He was currently pursuing a career as a lifestyle influencer, while living in an expensive downtown apartment that my parents had co-signed for. He woke up at noon, posted pictures of expensive lattes on social media, and called my parents whenever his bank account hit zero. I learned early on that the only way to survive was to build a financial and emotional fortress around myself. For 6 years, I lived like a ghost. I maximized my 401k contributions so the money was completely out of reach. I drove a 10-year-old Honda sedan that rattled terrifyingly when it hit 60 on the highway. I declined invitations to bars, to concerts, to everything. Every time my coworkers went out for expensive steaks to celebrate a promotion, I went home, ate a cold turkey sandwich, and transferred the money I would have spent straight into a high-yield savings account. I was channeling every ounce of my energy, every drop of sweat equity, into one singular goal: a home. I wanted a piece of the earth that belonged solely to me. A place where the locks on the doors meant I decided who was allowed inside. A place where my family could not reach me. My friend Marcus, a guy I met in a brutal sophomore year calculus class, was the only person who truly understood. We were having cheap diner coffee one Sunday morning when I finally opened my banking app and showed him my savings account balance. Marcus stared at the numbers on my phone, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Man, you actually did it. You have the full down payment. 20%? I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of bone-deep exhaustion and profound pride, plus enough to cover all the closing costs and emergency repairs. I start touring houses next weekend with a realtor." "Do not tell your family," Marcus warned immediately, pointing his coffee cup directly at my chest. His expression was dead serious. "I am absolutely serious, Arthur. The second they smell money, the second they know you have actual assets, they will find a way to make it about Julian. They will guilt you into paying his debts." I should have listened. God, I should have listened to him. But there is a pathetic, deeply ingrained part of the human psyche that constantly craves parental validation, no matter how many times you have been burned. You keep touching the hot stove, desperately hoping that this time, it will feel like a warm hug. A month later, I found the house. I negotiated fiercely, signed the mountain of paperwork, and secured the mortgage. The ink was barely dry when my parents invited me over for one of Eleanor's famous Thanksgiving-style Sunday dinners. The dining room table was groaning under the weight of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and freshly baked rolls. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted garlic, felt festive. For a brief, foolish moment it felt safe. As we sat down and began passing the plates, I took a deep breath. My heart was fluttering with excitement. "I have some news," I said, looking from my father to my mother. "I finally closed on a house. I get the keys on Friday." Eleanor dropped her serving spoon into the mashed potatoes. She clapped her hands together, her eyes shining with what looked like genuine tears. "Oh, Arthur, that is wonderful. We are so incredibly proud of you." Richard nodded approvingly, taking a slow sip of his expensive red wine. "Real estate is a smart investment, son. Assuming you manage the property taxes right. Good job." For exactly 10 seconds, I felt it. That elusive, fragile warmth of a family being genuinely happy for my success. Then Julian pushed his plate back. He slouched in his chair, swirling the ice in his crystal glass. "Must be nice having that corporate engineering salary," he muttered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. The resentment in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Some of us are still trying to figure out our path and struggling to survive. But sure, go ahead and buy a massive mansion just for one person." The air in the dining room instantly turned to ice. I looked at Julian, then at my parents. I waited for Richard to reprimand him. I waited for Eleanor to tell him to be respectful of my achievement. Nobody corrected him. Nobody said a word. "It is a modest 3-bedroom house, Julian," I said, keeping my voice carefully level. "And I worked very hard for it. I saved for 6 years. Right?" Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes and letting out a harsh laugh. "You sit in an air-conditioned office and type on a keyboard. It is not exactly heavy lifting, bro. Anyway, Mom, when are we going to look at those downtown lofts you promised to help me with? My lease is up in 2 months and I need a place with better lighting for my videos." Eleanor immediately shifted her attention away from me, leaning toward Julian with a placating, eager smile. "Next weekend, sweetheart, I promise. We will find you something perfect." I ate the rest of my meal in total silence. The food tasted like ash in my mouth. I realized then that my victory was not theirs to celebrate. My financial independence was actually a massive threat to the family structure. By buying a house, I was proving that I did not need them, while simultaneously highlighting Julian's complete and utter failure to launch. I excused myself early, citing a busy work week ahead. I drove back to my tiny, cramped rented apartment and packed the rest of my cardboard boxes in the dark. I thought that uncomfortable dinner was the end of it. I thought it was just another classic display of their favoritism. I had no idea it was just the match being struck. The explosion was coming, and they had been carefully planting the dynamite while smiling directly in my face. The illusion of peace lasted exactly 4 days after I moved into the new house. I was at work, sitting in my cubicle on the 4th floor of my company's building, deep into a complex coding sprint. My headphones were on, blocking out the office noise. My phone, sitting next to my keyboard, began to vibrate. I ignored it. Then it vibrated again, and again. It was a relentless buzzing, like an angry hornet trapped against the glass of my desk. I pulled my headphones down, annoyed, and picked up the device. I saw 5 missed calls from Marcus and a string of rapid-fire text messages. The last message read, "Arthur, you need to look at Facebook right now. Do not reply to anything. Just look. Call me immediately after." My stomach completely dropped. A cold dread washed over me. I opened the Facebook app, an app one rarely used anyway except to check on extended family birthdays. Right at the top of my feed, pinned and heavily boosted by the algorithm, was a public post from Julian. It had been up for 3 hours. It had hundreds of likes, dozens of shares, and an endless, scrolling stream of comments. The post read, "It absolutely breaks my heart to see how greed can destroy a family. While I have been struggling to get on my feet and facing eviction, my older brother secretly manipulated our parents. He used the inheritance money our late grandmother explicitly meant for my first home, and he bought a luxury house for himself instead. He left me with nothing. Family is supposed to protect each other, but I guess money is more important to some people. Please pray for my parents. They are devastated by his betrayal. Attached to the post was a high-resolution photo of my new house. A photo he must have taken from his car, parked directly across my street. He had driven to my home, photographed it, and used it as a prop for his massive lie. I stopped breathing. The office around me, the hum of the servers, the clicking of keyboards, the low chatter of my colleagues by the water cooler, completely faded away. I was trapped in a vacuum of sheer, unadulterated panic and rage. I scrolled through the comments with a shaking thumb. People I had known since high school, extended family members, church acquaintances, and complete strangers. They were tearing me apart. I can't believe Arthur would do something so evil. Taking money from your own brother? What a sociopath. Julian, stay strong. You should get a lawyer and sue him for everything he has. It was a meticulously crafted lie. It was a public execution of my character. Before I could even process the magnitude of the defamation, my phone rang in my hand. It was Aunt Beatrice, my mother's older sister. She was a woman known for her gossip and her fake, church pew sweetness. I answered it, stepping out into the office hallway, desperately needing someone to talk sense into. "Arthur, honey, I saw the post," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with sweet, syrupy concern. "I am so worried about you. What is going on? Why are you and Julian fighting like this in public?" "Aunt B, it is a complete and utter lie," I whispered fiercely, pacing the carpeted hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I never touched any inheritance. Grandpa's money was gone years ago. Dad spent it on Julian's first car. I bought this place with my own savings from my salary. He is making it up to ruin me." There was a slight pause on the line, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in her breathing. "Well," Beatrice said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more probing and less comforting. "Your mother is just devastated, Arthur. She says you won't even discuss the property with them. Did you put the house entirely in your name? Are there any co-signers? Maybe if you just put Julian on the deed, or gave him half the equity, this would all blow over and the family could heal." I stopped pacing. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. She wasn't calling to check on me. She wasn't calling to hear my side of the story. She was fishing for legal information. She was acting as an intelligence gatherer for my parents to find out how vulnerable the deed to my house was. "I have to go back to work, Beatrice," I said coldly, my voice turning to stone. I hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. I felt entirely surrounded. It was like fighting a brutal custody battle over my own sanity, and the opposing counsel was my entire bloodline. I left work early that day. I couldn't look at my computer screen. I drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands cramped. When I pulled into my driveway, the house felt different. The sanctuary had been breached. My address was out there. The whole world thought I was a thief. That night, exhaustion finally dragged me down. I fell asleep on a mattress on the floor of the master bedroom, my phone clutched in my hand. But at 2 a.m., my eyes snapped open. A sound. Metal scraping against metal. I lay perfectly still in the dark, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. The sound came from the front porch. Someone was at my front door. I rolled off the mattress, moving completely silently in my bare feet. I crept down the hallway, avoiding the floorboards I knew creaked. I reached the living room window and carefully, millimeter by millimeter, peeled back the edge of the window blind. Under the dim orange glow of the street lamp, 2 figures were standing on my porch. One of them was Julian. He was holding a heavy Maglite flashlight. The other man, holding a set of metallic lock-picking tools and a heavy-duty drill, was working on my front door deadbolt. Julian had brought a locksmith to my house in the middle of the night. He was trying to change the locks and physically take possession of the property while I was inside sleeping, likely hoping to claim squatters' rights or force a confrontation before the courts even got involved. A surge of adrenaline hit my bloodstream like a freight train. Every primal instinct screamed at me to throw the door open, tackle him off my porch, and beat him until he couldn't walk. but a cold, calculating voice in my head, the voice of an engineer trained to document, analyze, and solve complex problems, took over. I pulled out my phone, switched the camera to video mode, and hit record. Through the small gap in the blinds, I filmed the locksmith working on the lock. I filmed Julian checking his watch, pacing nervously, and whispering impatiently. I zoomed in to capture their faces clearly under the porch light. "Hey!" I heard the locksmith mutter, his voice carrying through the thin glass. "This is a high-security strike plate. I can't pick this easily. I have to drill it out. It's gonna be loud." "Then drill it," Julian hissed loudly, his face contorted in anger. "It is my house. Just do it." I hit stop on the recording. I walked slowly backwards into the hallway. I reached for the digital alarm keypad I had installed on the wall the very first day I moved in. I lifted the plastic cover and slammed my palm against the red panic button. A siren, deafening, piercing, and terrifyingly loud, erupted from both the inside and outside of the house. The security strobe lights on the porch flashed blindingly white, turning the front yard into a chaotic disco of panic. Through the window, I watched Julian and the locksmith physically jump back in absolute terror. The locksmith dropped his heavy drill on the concrete porch, turned, and sprinted toward a white van parked down the street. Julian stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds, his face pale as a ghost in the flashing strobe lights, before he turned and fled across my front lawn. He tripped over the garden hose, face planted into the grass, scrambled up, and ran into the darkness. I stood in the pulsing lights of the alarm system, breathing heavily, my chest heaving. The police arrived exactly 8 minutes later with their sirens blaring. I opened the door and showed them the video on my phone. I pointed to the scratches on my deadbolt and the drill left on the porch. I filed a formal police report for attempted breaking and entering and vandalism. The officer asked if I wanted to press criminal charges right then and there. "Not tonight," I said, my voice eerily calm. I needed this ammunition for the larger war. I needed it on paper. The officer handed me a carbon copy of the police report, complete with Julian's name and the exact timestamp of the crime. As the squad car pulled away, casting red and blue lights across my living room walls, I locked the door and slid down to the floor, resting my back against the heavy wood. They had tried to break into my home. My own brother had tried to drill my locks. Any remaining sorrow was completely gone. The lingering, pathetic hope for a happy family dynamic was dead and buried in the front yard. In its place was a cold, impenetrable resolve. They wanted a lawsuit? They wanted to drag my name through the mud and steal my property? Fine. I was going to burn their entire narrative to the ground. The next morning, I did not call my parents. I did not text Julian to scream at him. I didn't post a defense on Facebook. I called Marcus. "I need a lawyer," I said the moment he answered the phone. "I don't need a family mediator. I need the meanest, sharpest, most relentless real estate and inheritance attorney in this entire city." Marcus didn't hesitate for a single second. Victoria Vance. She handled my boss's messy divorce last year. She destroyed the opposition. She is brilliant, but she is expensive, Arthur. Really expensive. "I do not care what she costs," I replied, staring at the copy of the police report sitting on my kitchen counter. "Get me a meeting. Today." At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I walked into a massive high-rise building in the center of downtown. Victoria Vance's office was on the 30th floor, an intimidating suite walled in glass and polished steel that looked out over the entire city skyline. Victoria herself was even more intimidating than her office. She was a woman in her late 40s, wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. Her eyes were piercing, assessing me with the cold, calculated precision of a surgeon about to operate. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from her massive mahogany desk and laid out everything I had. I placed the lawsuit summons on the desk. Next to it, I placed a thick binder containing my bank statements, pay stubs, and tax returns detailing my salary and savings over the last 6 years. Then, I placed the police report from the midnight break-in and finally, printed screenshots of Julian's defamatory social media post and the hateful comments. Victoria reviewed the documents in absolute silence for 10 agonizing minutes. The only sound in the massive room was the ticking of a heavy antique clock on the wall and the crisp rustling of paper as she flipped through my bank statements. Finally, she closed the binder, leaned back in her chair, steepled her fingers, and looked directly at me. "This lawsuit is garbage, Mr. Arthur," she said, her voice smooth but laced with steel. "They are claiming a verbal family agreement supersedes documented financial reality. It is a desperate, pathetic legal tactic. It is based entirely on the assumption that you will fold under emotional pressure and simply hand over the deed to avoid the public humiliation." "I am not folding," I said, my voice steady. "I will burn the house down before I give it to him." "Good," Victoria said, a small, predatory smile touching the corner of her mouth. "Because in a courtroom, emotions are completely useless. The judge does not care about your feelings. The judge cares about paper. We have the paper to prove you bought the house. But they will bring your parents to the stand to testify under oath about this imaginary promise. It will be 2 against 1. We need someone from your family to testify to the opposite. Someone who knows there was no inheritance designated for Julian, and who is willing to say it on the record." My mind raced. My parents had tightly controlled the family narrative for years. They ruled the extended family with an iron fist of gossip and manipulation. Who could possibly stand up to them? "My cousin Leo," I said suddenly, leaning forward. "Leo lived with us for 2 years when his parents were struggling financially. He knows exactly how my parents treated me. He knows I paid my own way through college. He knows my grandparents left no special fund for Julian because he was sitting at the table when the will was read." "Call him," Victoria instructed, pushing her desk phone toward me. "Get an affidavit. We need him locked in." I called Leo the moment I left the building and got to my car. He answered warmly. When I explained the lawsuit and the situation, he sounded genuinely outraged. "That is insane, Arthur," Leo said over the phone. "Of course I will testify for you. Uncle Richard is out of his mind trying to steal your house. Julian doesn't deserve a dime. Send me the paperwork. I'll sign whatever your lawyer needs." For a brief moment, sitting in the parking garage, I felt a massive wave of profound relief wash over me. I had an ally within the bloodline. I had a shield against their lies. I spent the next 3 weeks operating like a machine. I went to work, I organized my financial records spanning back to my very first paycheck, and I communicated only with Victoria. My parents sent me daily emails. A bizarre, psychotic mix of threatening legal jargon from their lawyer and emotional manipulation from my mother about how I was breaking her heart and tearing the family apart. I didn't reply to a single one. I simply forwarded them to Victoria, who filed them all in a separate folder marked Evidence of Harassment. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, I was sitting in Victoria's office, reviewing the final draft of my testimony. Her assistant knocked frantically and walked in, looking incredibly tense. She handed Victoria a single sheet of paper. Victoria read it, her jaw tightening so hard I could see the muscle flutter in her cheek. She laid the paper on her desk, let out a slow breath, and looked up at me. "We have a massive problem," she said, her voice entirely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. "What is it?" I asked, a cold knot forming instantly in my stomach. Opposing counsel just submitted their final witness list to the court. Victoria turned the paper around so I could see it. "Your cousin Leo is on it, right?" I nodded, confused. "He is testifying for us." Victoria shook her head slowly. "No, Arthur. He is listed as a primary witness for the plaintiff. For your parents. He submitted a sworn, notarized statement this morning claiming he personally heard you acknowledge the inheritance money was meant for Julian, and that you bragged to him about taking it anyway." The room violently spun. The polished steel and glass of the office seemed to close in on me, suffocating me. Leo, my cousin, the guy I had tutored through high school math, the guy who had eaten at my table, Why? I choked out, the betrayal hitting me like a physical, crushing blow to the chest. He knows the truth. Why would he lie under oath? Victoria turned her computer monitor toward me. It showed a public record financial database. I ran a deep background check the second I saw his name on their list. Leo is drowning in debt. He was facing foreclosure on his own condo. 2 days ago, a massive payment of $35,000 was made to clear his primary debts. The source of the funds traces back to a joint checking account held by Richard and Eleanor Vance. They bought him. My parents literally purchased my cousin's perjury. They paid him $35,000 to lie under oath, to commit a felony, just to secure a house for Julian. The level of corruption, the sheer depravity of what they were willing to do to destroy their eldest son, was suffocating. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. Every single person I shared blood with was actively trying to ruin my life. I was standing in the dead center of the eye of the storm, completely alone, surrounded by people who wore the faces of family but operated like a ruthless cartel. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine, searching for any sign of weakness. Arthur, do you want to settle? We can drag this out, make it incredibly expensive for them in legal fees, and maybe negotiate a cash payout to make them go away. It is safer than going to trial with a family member committing perjury against you. I closed my eyes. I thought about the smell of fresh paint in my house. I thought about the cold turkey sandwiches, the 10-year-old car, the 6 years of relentless, agonizing discipline. And then I thought about Julian, standing on my porch with a locksmith, smiling in the dark, believing he had one. I stopped trembling. I opened my eyes. I looked up at Victoria, and the fire in my chest burned away the very last remnants of my grief. No, I said, my voice cold as ice. We do not settle. We are going to court, and we are going to destroy them. I didn't know it yet, but my salvation wasn't going to come from my cousin, or my friends, or even my bank statements. It was going to come from an old man who had watched my parents' dysfunction from the shadows for decades, holding a secret that was about to blow the roof off the courthouse. The county courthouse was a massive, imposing structure built from thick slabs of gray concrete and heavy tinted glass. It was designed to make you feel incredibly small the moment you walked through the heavy revolving doors, and it did its job perfectly. The air inside smelled like a mixture of old floor wax, polished mahogany wood, and the stale, nervous sweat of 1,000 people fighting over the broken pieces of their lives. I walked down the long, echoey hallway on the 4th floor beside Victoria Vance, my attorney. I was wearing my best dark navy suit, the one I had bought specifically for corporate presentations. My palms were freezing cold, and a tight knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach, but my mind was entirely clear. I was not walking into this building as a son looking for parental approval. I was not walking in as an older brother trying to keep the peace. I was walking in as a defendant fighting for my financial life against a highly organized, hostile entity. We pushed through the heavy double oak doors of courtroom 4B. The room was suffocatingly tense, the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The wooden pews in the gallery were mostly empty, save for a few law clerks observing the day's docket. My family was already seated at the plaintiff's table. My father, Richard, wore a sharp charcoal suit. He sat perfectly straight, his shoulders squared. He looked like a man about to close a highly lucrative commercial real estate deal. He radiated a sickening aura of unearned confidence. He truly believed he was the patriarch demanding righteous obedience from a rebellious subordinate. Next to him was my mother, Eleanor. She was clutching a crumpled white tissue in her hands, already wearing the meticulously crafted mask of a heartbroken, long-suffering matriarch. She had dressed down slightly, wearing a modest beige cardigan, visually playing the part of the fragile victim. And then there was Julian. My younger brother was wearing a tailored navy suit that my parents had undoubtedly paid for with a credit card. He looked entirely too smug. He leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, whispered something to their lawyer, Bernard Langford, and actually let out a quiet chuckle. They looked incredibly comfortable. They were sitting in the trap of their own massive complacency. They were entirely convinced that they held all the winning cards because they had successfully purchased my cousin Leo's perjury with a $35,000 payoff. They thought I was going to crack under the pressure of a public family spectacle. They assumed I would fold the moment the emotional manipulation began. Judge Evelyn Carter entered the room precisely at 9 o'clock. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s. She wore her black robe like armor. She had a reputation across the city for running a brutally efficient courtroom and possessing absolutely zero tolerance for frivolous litigation. She took her seat at the high bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and slammed her wooden gavel down once. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Let us begin," Judge Carter announced, her voice cutting sharply through the heavy air. "I have reviewed the preliminary filings for Vance versus Vance. This is a dispute over property ownership and alleged misappropriation of inherited funds. Counsel for the plaintiff, Mr. Langford, you have the burden of proof. You may call your first witness." Bernard Langford stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He was a theatrical, slimy lawyer who clearly made his living on emotional manipulation rather than hard, documented facts. He smoothed his tie and called my father to the stand. Richard walked up to the witness box, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. He sat down, looking incredibly dignified. Bernard paced slowly in front of the witness box, speaking in a low, highly respectful tone. "Mr. Vance, could you explain to the court the specific nature of the verbal agreement regarding the family inheritance?" Bernard asked, his hands clasped behind his back. My father took a deep, measured breath, looking directly up at the judge to establish trust. "Yes, sir. When my parents passed away, we had a strict, binding family understanding. My mother always wanted Julian, her youngest grandson, to have substantial financial help buying his very first home. It was a well-known, explicitly understood verbal agreement within the household. Arthur knew this perfectly well. The money he used for his recent real estate purchase was part of a generational wealth transfer that he wrongfully intercepted and hoarded for himself. It was a brilliant, terrifying lie. He delivered it with the absolute conviction of a seasoned sociopath. He didn't stutter. He didn't look away. Victoria sat next to me at the defense table, her face a mask of carved stone. She did not raise a single objection. She simply took meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad, letting him dig a massive hole. Next, Bernard called my mother to the stand. Eleanor walked up to the box slowly. The theatrical performance immediately shifted into high gear. Her voice trembled perfectly on cue the moment she swore the oath. "Mrs. Vance," Bernard asked softly, playing the role of a sympathetic counselor, "can you tell us how this situation has impacted your family?" "We never wanted it to come to this," Eleanor wept softly, dabbing her completely dry eyes with the tissue. "We love Arthur. We truly, deeply do. But we cannot just stand by and let him steal his younger brother's future. We just want what was promised to Julian by his grandmother. Arthur is punishing us. He is tearing this family apart, and I simply do not know why he is acting so selfishly." I gripped the edge of the heavy wooden defense table until my knuckles turned white. Watching your own mother lie under oath to steal the roof over your head is a specific type of psychological violence I cannot adequately describe. It breaks something fundamental inside your brain. You finally realize that the woman who gave birth to you views you as nothing more than a sacrificial lamb for her favorite child. I thought about all those Thanksgiving dinners where I sat quietly, asking for nothing, while they showered Julian with praise. It was all a setup for this exact betrayal. Then came Julian. He adjusted his silk tie and put on his best performance of the struggling, victimized youth trying to survive in a harsh economy. He testified that he had been saving up for years, carefully planning his future. He boldly claimed that I had maliciously rushed to buy the house specifically to drain the family resources before he could get his life together. He looked directly at me from the witness box, his eyes full of arrogant defiance. But the real knife twist, the moment they had banked their entire legal strategy on, came when Bernard called Leo to the stand. My cousin walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. He could not look at me. His face was pale, and a fine sheen of nervous sweat covered his forehead. He took the oath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Leo," Bernard asked smoothly, leaning against the podium, "you have spent a considerable amount of time living under the same roof as the Vance family, correct?" "Yes," Leo answered, staring firmly down at his own hands. "And did you ever hear the defendant, Arthur Vance, speak about the inheritance money meant for Julian?" Leo swallowed hard. He glanced nervously over at the plaintiff's table. My father gave him a sharp, commanding nod. The $35,000 nod. "Yes," Leo lied, his voice shaking slightly. "Arthur told me he knew the money was supposed to go to Julian for a house. He said he did not care. He said he was going to take it and use it for his own down payment because Julian was irresponsible and didn't deserve it." A collective murmur rippled through the small gallery. Bernard smiled, looking triumphant. He turned to the judge, spreading his hands wide. "Your Honor, we have established a clear, undeniable pattern of deceit. We have 3 family members, including an objective third-party relative, corroborating the exact same events. The defendant acted in bad faith, violating a sacred family trust to enrich himself." Bernard sat down. My parents looked over at me with undisguised victory gleaming in their eyes. They had built an impenetrable wall of lies. They had successfully weaponized the justice system using their own bloodline. They thought the trial was over. They thought I was finished, destined to hand over the keys to my sanctuary. Judge Carter looked over her glasses at our table, her expression unreadable. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine these witnesses, Ms. Vance? Or do you intend to call your own?" Victoria stood up slowly. She buttoned her suit jacket with deliberate precision. She did not look flustered. She did not look intimidated. She looked exactly like an apex predator that had just cornered its prey in a dead-end canyon. "We will not be cross-examining these specific witnesses, Your Honor," Victoria said clearly, her voice echoing powerfully in the silent room. "We will let their perjury stand entirely on the official record. Instead, the defense calls our first and only witness. I call Mr. Henry Vance to the stand." The air in the courtroom instantly vanished. At the plaintiff's table, my father physically flinched, his spine snapping rigidly straight. The smug smile completely evaporated from Julian's face, replaced by pure confusion. Eleanor dropped her crumpled tissue onto the floor. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom slowly swung open. Uncle Henry walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with the slow, deliberate dignity of a man who had absolutely nothing to lose and nothing to hide. He was my father's older brother, a retired high school history teacher who had always kept a massive, intentional distance from Richard's toxic household. He had thick silver hair, wore a simple brown tweed suit, and carried an old leather satchel. He walked up to the witness box, placed his hand firmly on the Bible, and swore the oath in a loud, clear voice that demanded immediate respect. Victoria approached the wooden podium. She did not pace around the room like Bernard. She stood perfectly still, anchoring the entire room with her commanding presence. "Mr. Vance," Victoria began, her tone highly respectful but strictly professional, "could you clarify your exact relationship to the parties sitting in this room?" "Richard is my younger brother," Henry said, his deep voice carrying easily to the back of the gallery. "Julian and Arthur are my nephews. And you were present during the final years of your parents' lives, correct? The grandparents of the defendant, whose inheritance is currently in question. I was their primary, full-time caretaker for the last 5 years of their lives," Henry confirmed, adjusting his posture. "I managed their estate, I drove them to their medical appointments, I handled their grocery shopping, and I was physically present for every single legal and financial decision they made regarding their assets before they passed." Victoria picked up a document from our defense table. It was encased in a clear plastic protective sleeve. She handed copies to the court clerk. "Your Honor, I am formally submitting Defense Exhibit A into evidence. A copy has just been provided to opposing counsel." Bernard Langford scrambled to pick up the paper the clerk handed him. I watched closely as the color rapidly drained from Bernard's face while his eyes scanned the text. He practically stopped breathing. He looked like a man who had just unknowingly stepped on a live landmine. "Mr. Vance," Victoria continued, turning her unwavering attention back to Henry, "can you please tell the court exactly what this document is?" "That is a notarized, legally binding letter drafted by my father, William Vance, exactly 2 months before he passed away," Henry stated clearly. "It was drafted in the presence of his retained estate attorney and officially stamped by a registered public notary. I have kept the original secured in a bank safety deposit box until today." "And why was this specific letter drafted, Henry?" Victoria asked, her voice ringing out. Henry turned his head and looked directly at his brother Richard. The absolute disgust in Henry's eyes was palpable. "Because my parents were terrified. They knew exactly how Richard and Eleanor operated. They watched for years as Arthur was severely neglected, forced to fend for himself and pay for his own college, while Julian was given absolutely everything on a silver platter. They knew Richard would try to manipulate their will the second they were gone to steal from Arthur." "Objection!" Bernard shouted, jumping to his feet so fast he knocked his chair back. His voice was cracking with sheer panic. "Hearsay, conjecture. The witness is speculating on the emotional state of the deceased." "Overruled," Judge Carter snapped immediately, glaring at Bernard. "The witness was their primary caretaker and is providing necessary context for a formally notarized document. Sit down, Mr. Langford. Proceed, Ms. Vance." Victoria walked a few steps closer to the witness box. "Henry, would you please read the highlighted portion of your father's letter for the court?" Henry reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, unfolded his copy of the paper, and read. His voice was steady, delivering the words from the grave that would systematically dismantle my family's entire conspiracy. Quote, "Knowing the profound, destructive favoritism my son Richard shows toward his youngest child, Julian, I must be completely explicit in my final wishes to protect my eldest grandson. There is absolutely no special fund, no hidden college account, and no inheritance meant specifically for Julian's housing, vehicles, or personal use. I explicitly forbid Richard from reallocating any family assets to favor Julian over Arthur. Every single asset is to be liquidated and divided equally. If any party attempts to claim otherwise in a legal setting, they are directly violating my final dying wish and committing outright fraud against this estate." Henry slowly lowered the paper and took off his glasses. End quote. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound it was actually deafening. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. My father was staring blankly at the mahogany table, his face a horrifying shade of pale, sickly gray. Eleanor had both hands clamped tightly over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. Julian looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the floor. They had built an entire massive lawsuit on a flimsy verbal promise, completely unaware that my grandfather had perfectly anticipated their endless greed and left a legal sniper rifle directly in Uncle Henry's hands. But Victoria was not done. She was a lawyer who deeply believed in total, scorched-earth annihilation. "Thank you, Henry. You may step down," Victoria said smoothly. She walked back to the defense table. "Now, regarding the defendant's personal finances, which the plaintiffs claim to own, I am submitting Defense Exhibit B. This is a comprehensive forensic accounting of Arthur Vance's financial history spanning the last 6 consecutive years." She handed a massive, 4-inch thick binder to the court clerk, who carefully passed it up to the judge. "Your Honor," Victoria stated, her voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Every single dollar used to purchase the real estate property in question came directly from my client's corporate payroll deposits. We have provided 6 years of W-2s, complete tax returns, 401k contribution logs, and bank routing numbers tracking every transfer. There is absolutely zero commingling of inherited funds. Not 1 cent came from Richard Vance. The plaintiff's claim is not just factually incorrect. It is a malicious, highly calculated fabrication designed to steal a legally purchased property through the abuse of the judicial system. Victoria then turned to the large projector screen mounted on the courtroom wall. And finally, Your Honor, regarding the true character and the actual intentions of the plaintiffs, I am submitting Defense Exhibit C. She pressed a button on a small remote. The courtroom screens flickered to life. It was the high-definition security footage from my front porch alarm system. The video played clearly in the silent, dark room. There was Julian, holding the heavy Maglite flashlight. There was the hired locksmith with his heavy-duty drill. The audio captured the locksmith clearly saying he had to drill the lock to get inside. And then, clear as a bell, Julian's voice hissed aggressively from the courtroom speakers. Then drill it. It is my house. Just do it. Then the alarm blared on the video, the strobe lights flashed, and Julian tripped over the garden hose, face planting into the dirt and scrambling away like a pathetic thief in the night. That video was taken at 2 o'clock in the morning, exactly 3 days after my client legally closed on his home, Victoria said, turning to glare directly at Julian, who was currently shrinking in his chair. The plaintiffs did not just file a frivolous, fraudulent civil lawsuit. They actively engaged in attempted breaking and entering, a criminal act of vandalism and trespassing, trying to physically seize control of a property they knew perfectly well they did not own. Bernard Langford was completely silent. He did not raise a single objection. He actually pushed his chair back slightly, physically distancing himself from his own clients. He knew his entire career and legal license were flashing before his eyes because he had blindly trusted pathological liars without verifying their claims. Victoria turned to face the judge, her posture commanding and righteous. Your Honor, the plaintiffs have conspired to commit perjury. They have bribed a witness. They have attempted to defraud my client of his entire life savings. We request that this case be immediately dismissed with extreme prejudice, and we ask the court to formally assign all legal fees, court costs, and punitive damages to the plaintiffs. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Judge Evelyn Carter slowly took off her reading glasses. She placed them deliberately on the bench. She did not look down at the massive pile of paperwork anymore. She focused her incredibly sharp, terrifyingly cold gaze directly on my father at the plaintiff's table. Mr. Vance, Judge Carter said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, the exact kind of dead calm that precedes a catastrophic hurricane. In my 20 years sitting on this bench, I have seen families fight viciously over money. I have seen standard human greed. But I have rarely, if ever, witnessed a conspiracy so deeply malicious, so utterly devoid of basic parental decency, as the one you have proudly presented in my courtroom today. Richard opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer another pathetic lie, but the judge raised a single index finger, silencing him instantly. You sat in that chair under oath and you lied to this court, she continued, her voice rising steadily in volume and intensity. You convinced your wife to lie. You paid off a younger relative to commit felony perjury, which I will be forwarding to the district attorney's office for a separate criminal review. And you, Julian Vance. She shifted her piercing gaze to my brother. Julian practically shrank into his oversized suit, staring at the floor. You were caught on high-definition camera attempting to violently burglarize a home you have absolutely no legal right to, Judge Carter stated, her disgust echoing off the walls. You are incredibly lucky the defendant has not yet pressed criminal charges, because based on that footage, you belong in a county jail cell, not sitting in a civil courtroom demanding a free house. Julian started to cry. Real, pathetic, ugly tears of a spoiled child finally facing massive consequences for the first time in his entire life. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. This case is dismissed in its entirety with prejudice, Judge Carter declared, her voice booming. The plaintiffs are permanently barred from ever refiling these claims or any related claims regarding this specific property. Furthermore, I am granting the defense's request in full. The plaintiffs are ordered to pay all of Arthur Vance's legal fees, which I expect to be substantial. Court is adjourned. She struck the gavel with incredible force. The sound of that wood hitting the block was the most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of heavy iron chains breaking off my chest. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable legal vindication. Victoria packed her leather briefcase with swift, highly efficient movements. "Let's go, Arthur," she said quietly, snapping the brass locks shut. "You won. We are done here." I stood up. My legs felt a little weak from the adrenaline crash, but my spine was perfectly straight. I walked down the center aisle, Uncle Henry clapping a heavy, immensely supportive hand on my shoulder as we exited the double doors into the brightly lit hallway. We didn't even make it to the elevator bank before I heard heavy, desperate footsteps rushing behind us on the marble floor. "Arthur! Arthur! Please wait!" It was Richard. He was rushing down the hallway, Eleanor trailing closely behind him, her face a horrific mess of ruined mascara and genuine panic. Julian was nowhere to be seen. He had likely bolted out the side emergency exit to avoid facing my wrath. I stopped and turned around slowly. Victoria stepped slightly in front of me, raising her hand, ready to legally intercept, but I gently touched her arm, signaling that I needed to handle this myself. Richard stopped a few feet away, panting slightly. He looked completely desperate, his authoritative, patriarchal aura entirely shattered into a million pieces. "Arthur, please. You have to understand the pressure we were under. We were just trying to protect your brother from being homeless. He is struggling financially. We are family, Arthur. You can't let the judge stick us with your lawyer's fees. It will completely ruin us. It's tens of thousands of dollars. You ruined yourselves," I said. My voice was eerily steady. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel sad. I felt absolutely nothing for the man standing in front of me. The emotional well was completely dry. Eleanor reached out, her shaking fingers grasping desperately at the sleeve of my navy suit jacket. "Arthur, sweetie, please. Forgive us. We made a terrible mistake. We will make it right, I promise. You are my eldest son. You have to help us fix this." I looked down at her hand, then looked directly into her eyes, stripping away decades of guilt and manipulation. A real mother does not take her son to court to steal the roof over his head. A real family does not by perjury to destroy their own blood. You made your choice. You chose Julian. You have always chosen Julian. Now, you get to live with the consequences of him. I stepped back forcefully, making her hand drop from my arm. "Do not ever call my phone again. Do not ever come to my house. If you step 1 foot on my property, I will immediately have you arrested for criminal trespassing. This relationship is over." I turned my back on them and walked directly into the elevator. The metal doors slid shut with a satisfying click, cutting off the pathetic sight of my parents standing in the courthouse hallway, completely destroyed by their own toxic greed. 6 months later, the final puzzle piece fell into place, revealing exactly why my parents had been so incredibly desperate to steal my house and why they needed a free asset so badly. I was having a nice dinner with Uncle Henry and Marcus at a high-end steakhouse downtown to celebrate the end of the year. Henry had been keeping close tabs on the fallout through the extended family grapevine, specifically through Aunt Beatrice, who had quickly changed sides when the money dried up. "They lost their house, Arthur," Henry said quietly, slicing into his ribeye steak. I stopped chewing, lowering my fork. "What? How?" "Richard and Eleanor went completely bankrupt," Henry explained, shaking his head in disbelief. "It turns out Julian didn't just have standard credit card debt. A year ago, he went into a luxury dealership and bought a brand new Porsche, a Porsche 911 Carrera. He convinced your parents to co-sign the massive loan, claiming he absolutely needed a luxury vehicle for his influencer brand image to get sponsorships." Marcus let out a loud, echoing whistle, nearly dropping his drink. "A Porsche? Are you kidding me?" The kid didn't even have a job. It gets so much worse, Henry continued, taking a sip of his wine. To save the Porsche from being repossessed when Julian inevitably defaulted on the payments, and to secretly pay off Leo's $35,000 bribe for the trial, Richard secretly took out a massive home equity line of credit, a second mortgage on their primary home. When they lost the lawsuit and were legally forced to pay your massive legal fees on top of their own lawyers' bills, they completely drained their accounts. They couldn't make the payments. The bank formally foreclosed on their house last week. I sat back in my chair, absolutely stunned. Where are they living? They are currently renting a tiny, run-down two-bedroom apartment near the noisy industrial park by the airport, Henry said with a grim smile. And because the Porsche was finally repossessed anyway, Julian is currently sleeping on their cheap living room sofa, complaining about the Wi-Fi speed. Karma did not just softly knock on their front door. It drove a commercial tow truck right through their living room window. They had willingly sacrificed their eldest son to finance a luxury lifestyle for their youngest. And in the end, the universe stripped them of absolutely everything. The massive fallout from the trial did not just cleanse my personal life. It sent an incredible shockwave through my professional world as well. During the chaos of the lawsuit, Derek, a deeply insecure and highly competitive coworker of mine, had somehow found Julian's defamatory Facebook post. Derek had gleefully spread the vicious rumors around the office water cooler, trying to sabotage my professional reputation. He painted me to upper management as an unstable, untrustworthy thief who stole from his own grandmother. He desperately thought the scandal would ruin my chances for the upcoming department promotion, clearing the path for himself. He was incredibly, catastrophically wrong. The Monday morning immediately following the trial, I walked directly into the executive suite on the top floor and formally requested a private meeting with our CEO, Mr. Sterling. He was a sharp, fiercely intelligent man who valued extreme integrity and problem-solving above almost everything else. I sat down in his massive office, handed him a certified, stamped copy of the judge's final dismissal, and briefly, professionally explained the extortion attempt my family had orchestrated and how I had legally dismantled it. Mr. Sterling read the legal document in total silence. He looked at the official court seal, then looked up at me. His expression was not one of corporate pity, but of profound, deep respect. "Let me get this straight, Arthur?" Mr. Sterling asked, raising a silver eyebrow. "You fought off a highly coordinated legal and emotional attack from your own immediate family, successfully protected your personal assets in a court of law, and still managed to deliver the highly complex beta code for the new software launch 3 days ahead of schedule?" "Yes, sir," I replied firmly, maintaining strong eye contact. "I do not, under any circumstances, let personal turbulence affect my professional output or the integrity of my work." Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, leaning back in his leather chair. "I heard the ridiculous rumors Derek was spreading around the IT department. I despise office gossip, Arthur, but I despise cowards even more. A man who can completely maintain his composure, execute strategic thinking, and deliver results while standing in the dead center of a personal hurricane is exactly the kind of man I need leading a major team." That exact Friday afternoon, the company sent out a global email announcing my official promotion to Senior Project Director. It came with a massive base salary increase, stock options, and my own corner office with a view of the city skyline. Derek was quietly transferred to a lower-level data entry team in the basement 2 weeks later. He was completely unable to look me in the eye whenever we passed in the corporate hallway. The professional validation was incredible, but the true, deep healing happened far away from the corporate office. A month later, the weather finally warmed up, bringing a beautiful, crisp spring breeze. I decided it was finally time to properly christen the house. I didn't invite a single extended relative out of a misplaced sense of toxic obligation. I didn't invite people who demanded my resources while offering absolutely nothing in return. I threw a massive housewarming barbecue in my backyard, and I invited my real family. Marcus was there, wearing an apron, happily manning the charcoal grill and drinking a cheap domestic beer, laughing loudly at a joke someone told. Uncle Henry was sitting comfortably on the new patio furniture I had bought, enjoying a glass of sweet iced tea and telling hilarious stories about his college days in the 70s. Even Victoria Vance, my brilliant lawyer, stopped by for an hour. She traded her sharp, intimidating legal suits for a comfortable cashmere sweater and jeans, actually smiling warmly as she admired the landscaping I had done in the front yard. I stood alone on my back porch, leaning against the smooth wooden railing, simply watching them interact. The rich smell of burning charcoal and grilled meat filled the evening air. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky in brilliant, breathtaking shades of orange, pink, and deep purple, casting a warm, incredibly peaceful glow over the freshly cut green grass of my backyard. For the very first time in my entire 32 years of life, my stomach was not tied in tight, anxious knots. I was not nervously anticipating a harsh, passive-aggressive criticism from my mother about my clothing or my weight. I was not anxiously bracing for a sudden financial demand from my father to fix a problem he created. I was not actively suppressing my own existence, my own happiness, to make extra room for my brother's massive, fragile ego. I took a deep, long breath of the cool evening air, filling my lungs completely. The house felt entirely different now. It was no longer just an expensive real estate purchase. It was no longer a stressful battleground or a piece of contested property sitting in a depressing legal file on a judge's desk. It was a home, my home, fully, undeniably, and legally mine. Every brick, every hardwood floorboard, every blade of grass belonged to me. I realized something incredibly vital as I stood there watching the people who actually cared about me. Society constantly pushes this dangerous, toxic narrative that blood is always thicker than water. We are systematically brainwashed from childhood into believing that simply sharing DNA means you owe someone your life, your sanity, and your hard-earned resources. We are repeatedly told to forgive the unforgivable, to turn the other cheek, just because the person holding the knife happens to be a parent or a sibling. But blood is just a biological accident. True family is an action. Family is defined exclusively by the people who stand fiercely beside you when everything else shatters into pieces. Family is defined by mutual respect, by brutal honesty, and by the sacred, unbreakable boundaries you draw to protect your own mental peace. I did not just win a civil court case against Richard, Eleanor, and Julian. I won my entire life back. I permanently broke a generational curse of emotional abuse and financial exploitation. I reclaimed my voice, I fiercely protected my boundaries, and I finally truly understood my own incredible worth as a man. I learned that sometimes the most profound act of self-love is having the absolute courage to walk away from the people who are determined to destroy you. So, to anyone listening to this story right now who feels completely trapped, to anyone who is being financially or emotionally drained by a golden child sibling, or manipulated by parents who use weaponized guilt to control your life, please hear me clearly. You do not owe your abusers your future. You are allowed to lock the front door. You are allowed to build a massive fortress to protect your peace. And you are absolutely allowed to fight back with everything you have. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line in the sand to protect your own peace and your own hard work? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.